Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Matt Coda. I'm with the firm Meadow Hill, an energy consulting firm based in Montpelier, and this is the Vermont Clean Heat Standard webinar. Today's webinar, we're going to talk about what the Clean Heat Standard is, what's a credit, how it will work, and what it will all cost. But before we do that, I'd like to acknowledge at the very outset that there is a wide diversity of thought leaders on this webinar, and presumably that will watch it when it's recorded. We're talking about electricians, plumbers, heating contractors, gas and oil technicians, about fuel dealers, fuel transporters, wholesalers, weatherization experts, lawmakers who voted for this law, lawmakers that voted against this law, interested consumers, businesses, all want to know what the Clean Heat Standard is. And we've taken many calls asking about it, asking for an explanation. And this is the best way that I can see going forward that explains where we are now in this very complex but important policy about how we heat our homes and buildings in here in Vermont. So the brief summary of what a clean heat standard is simply put, it's a policy designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions associated with heating Vermont buildings. It started as a bill, S5, which you may remember, became a law, Act 18, and it requires the state of Vermont to build a rule that complies with the thermal sector reductions inherent in the Global Warming Solutions Act, or the GWSA, which you hear. So that's the law that was passed in 2020 that mandates a 40% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions below 1990 levels by 2030. The legislature will review the regulation as designed by the Public Utility Commission in January and decide whether or not it should be implemented, and that will happen just in a couple of months. If the legislature, of course, fails to introduce a carbon reduction policy or passes the Clean Heat Standard or passes one that is not as robust as some would like, Vermont could be sued for failure to comply with the Global Warming Solutions Act. And if the state loses in state superior court, the judge could compel the Agency of Natural Resources to devise a regulatory action, which is then approved by 8 members of the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. I say all that, and then I'm going to take a deep breath and a pause because this is really deep in the weeds. And that is not the purpose of this webinar. This purpose of the webinar is to ask the questions that are asked so often about the Clean Heat Standard for those that either sell fuel, sell heating equipment, install or service any of that, or purchase it. And you want to know, number one, how does it work? What is a clean heat credit? Who pays and how? And what it will cost? And while we know that those are the most commonly asked questions, we know that today we have far more clear answers. We don't have all the answers, but we have more answers today than we did just a week ago, and certainly a lot more than when this legislation passed in 2023. I first learned about the Clean Heat Standard in 2021. I've been working in energy policy for nearly 20 years now here in Vermont, and I currently serve on the Public Utility Commission's Technical Advisory Group and their Equity Advisory Group, developing the regulation which will become the Clean Heat Standard. And I said when I first read the white paper back in 2021 by a small group of big energy thinkers that this is the most consequential government regulation of the heating fuels industry ever contemplated in the history of Vermont. But I revised that, and it is really the most consequential regulation ever devised for heating fuels, heating oil and propane ever in the United States. We are the first. We probably won't be the last. There are other states that are following, including Maryland and Massachusetts, perhaps New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. But this is really grand in its scale and its scope. This is not a fee or a tax in order to pay for a weatherization program or even a heat pump rebate program. It is far more ambitious in what it hopes to accomplish. But I think it's important before we get there is for you to understand where we've come from and where we're going. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Remember, this roller coaster started in 2020, and that's when the Global Warming Solutions Act became law. That's the law that requires us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 26% below 2005 levels by 2025. That's just a couple months. And then reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 40% from 1990 levels by the end of the decade. And then again, 80% in 25 years' time in the year 2050. Then in 2021, the Climate Council was created out of the Global Warming Solutions Act, and that Climate Council recommended the legislature pass a clean heat standard. That happened in 2021 and 2022. They did exactly that. The governor vetoed the clean heat standard, and it was sustained, meaning it did not become law by just a single vote. One vote decided to not implement it in 2022. In 2023, a different legislature came back and passed a substantially similar piece of legislation called S5 that became Act 18, and that became law, even though it was vetoed by just one vote in the Senate. So that created this, we're now in this process of creating a rule that will be reviewed by the legislature in January to determine whether or not they implement this standard. That will be voted on in 2025. And if they vote yes, they could vote yes, they could vote no. They could vote yes and could be overturned, or it could be vetoed and then fail to be sustained, to be overridden. But if they do, then in 2026, what happens is the first gallon of fossil fuel sold in January 1 of 2026 will be obligated, and there'll be fees attached with continuing to use fossil fuels for heat. So this is a complex web on how we get there. There's rulemaking, there's a technical advisory group, there's the equity advisory group. All are working on figuring out how to create this credit market, how to establish a value for any action that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, figuring out how much it costs and who pays and how that payment is created, and how to regulate this marketplace in which it is a competitive industry that is injecting this market approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But very simply, it's going to take money. So those that bring heating fuel into Vermont, whether it's heating oil, kerosene, propane, or natural gas, or coal, if you bring it into Vermont for ultimate consumption in Vermont, then there's going to be a fee associated with that, or a commensurate clean heat credit. That all goes into a bucket that's regulated by the Public Utility Commission, and they use those funds to incentivize the marketplace to encourage people to adopt clean heat measures, measures which show that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that use less fossil fuel for heat. And so it's those that continue to sell and use fossil fuel for heat, paying into a fund which is managed by the Public Utility Commission to encourage people to use less fossil fuel for heat. And this is the non-tradable, non-tangible commodity called clean heat credits. So what is a clean heat credit? Well, clean heat credit, quite simply, is a product or service that reduces greenhouse gas emissions. So it could be anything. It's not just one thing. It could be many things. It could be weatherization and air sealing. It could be an electric heat pump. It could be an electric heat pump water heater. It could be solar hot water on your rooftop, not PV. It could be geothermal wells. It could be sustainably sourced biofuels such as biodiesel, renewable propane, renewable natural gas. It could be green hydrogen. It could be a modern wood heating, or even a zero emission module trailer that home that will use less fossil fuels. It can even be geothermal or district heating as well. So there's lots of different things that make up to it, but certainly a big portion of that, because that's the direction energy policy is going, not just in Vermont, will be in heat pumps. So heat pumps, of course, have been around for a long time, been installed by heating oil and gas contractors as a great summer supplement to put in air conditioning and takes the chill off. But the more modern heat pumps deliver more BTUs for heat in the winter, and those are what we've seen incredible uptake in already. But in order to comply with the Global Warming Solutions Act, that pace has to increase pretty steadily. This slide comes from the Department of Public Service. It shows the historical and forecasted cold climate heat pumps. Anytime I show this slide, people go, wait a minute, we're supposed to get to 300,000 heat pumps. We have less than 300,000 homes in Vermont. And the answer is they're counting heat pumps not per home, but their larger homes need multiple heat pumps. So certainly anyone who installs heat pumps understands that one mini split might help a small home, small building, reduce greenhouse gas emissions or reduce propane or heating oil consumption, but most homes require one or more. So who owns these credits if you've done this work? Well, that's still to be determined. We don't know that yet. So if you go into any heating contractor, and I go into their homes and kitchens and offices and garages all the time in the summertime when I go travel around the state, and they all have a folder that looks something like this, of different shapes and sizes, that is essentially a clean heat measure that they have already done, that their customer has signed off on and given to them. And they can do this because the law makes it clear that even though the regulation may never come to pass, even though we don't know what those credits will shape or what they're worth, you can actually start collecting them as of January 1 of 2023. So many fuel dealers who sell clean heat measures and many heating contractors that do that, as well as supply warehouses, will have their customers fill out this form, assigning the credit to them. It's unknown value, but that's a way to assign the credit to someone. Will this work? We don't know. We don't know. I mean, if this becomes law, there'll be U-Haul trucks full of paper that are delivered to the PUC at 112 State Street, and they'll have to sort out who actually owns this credit. Is it the entity that provided the financial incentive for a consumer to install a heat pump or a wood stove or to purchase biofuel? Will it be the manufacturer of that piece of equipment, or the wholesaler of that equipment, or the retailer, or the installer, or will it be the consumer himself? Or will that have to be chopped up 5, 6, 7 different ways in order to retain ownership of that credit? These are answers we do not know yet. Certainly, those credits that have already been out there, those equipment that's already been installed, if an entity has provided a financial incentive for you to do that, they may claim credit for that. Why is this? There's this scramble for credits, and why does this all need to be adjudicated? Because these are what will be needed in order to lower the cost of the program. So who pays and how? So this is the phrase "in or into Vermont," and it's the most often confused. This is a very complex policy, right? It's very difficult to follow all the different moving parts and pieces, but this one is the most often confused, and it's the most basic. The fee is paid by those who bring the fuel in or into Vermont for ultimate consumption in Vermont. And because the way Vermont is, most of this is, there are going to be well over 100 of these obligated entities that will pay this fee. That's because it's not on wholesalers. It's certainly not on the big oil companies in Texas. It is on either the wholesalers that are in the state or the fuel providers that bring the fuel into their state for their customers. It has no difference whether you sell 2 gallons out of a barbecue cylinder or whether you sell 20 million gallons out of a wholesale terminal in Burlington. You are all part of this in or into language. All are required to register. Some will be required to pay based on not how many gallons you sell, but where the fuel came from and where you brought it to. So in Vermont, there are about 200,000 buildings that use heating oil or propane. They're served by distributors in 200 different locations. About a third of these retail locations are outside of Vermont. But even those that are located in Vermont, about 80% of them purchase their fuel from outside, and with good reason. When a fuel dealer wakes up in Dover, Vermont, you can decide whether to drive to Albany, New York, Springfield, Massachusetts, North Walpole, New Hampshire, or Hartford, Vermont. And we'll do so based on the price, the competitive price. Just like retailers like to price shop for the best price, just like consumers like to price shop for the best price, so do retailers when deciding where to purchase their fuel. And having that choice and that competition is what brings prices down. As such, the idea that a fuel dealer in Dover is going to drive to Burlington to avoid compliance, it just is not logical, especially when that truck has to fill up in January 3 times a day. You need a terminal that's closer, and most of the close terminals, particularly in southern Vermont, particularly on the eastern side of Vermont, are all located out of state. So it doesn't matter how big you are, how small you are, if you bring the fuel into Vermont where it's consumed, then you're responsible. So how do we find them? Through an annual fuel dealer registry that started on January 31st of this year. However, it was very difficult. The compliance rate was very low, so that was extended until February 29th. And thanks to a law passed this year, that was then moved to June 30th, recognizing that January and February is a pretty busy month for those that distribute heating fuel throughout the state. So that compliance date was moved. We still don't know if we have captured all of the fuel dealers. We know that at least 200 are required to register, but in fact, that number could double because it's not clear right now whether or not propane sold in 5-gallon canisters, those 20-pound cylinders, would in fact qualify or are required to pay into the fee and to register. That would double the number of obligated parties if that were the case. Every corner store, every hardware store, every convenience store that sells propane. It is, again, doesn't matter how big or small you are. If you sell out of a terminal or you sell it out of a pump, you sell it in a bag of coal, you distribute it in a truck, or in a canister. If you bring it into Vermont for ultimate consumption, if you sell it in Vermont, you have to register. And if you bring it into Vermont, as most do, that means you are obligated and there will be a fee attached to it. So obviously, the whole point of this very complicated structure is to avoid paying the fee so that you're more price competitive and for consumers as well. So what earns a credit? What kind of clean heat measures are necessary in order to comply with the Global Warming Solutions Act? Because remember, this policy is not creating a way to fund different objects or different equipment, different measures, but it's being done with express purpose. Act 18 says it must comply with the Global Warming Solutions Act. It must be designed in a way so that over the next 5 years, Vermont's emissions of greenhouse gas emissions from the thermal sector is 40% below where they were in 1990. And that is a significant transformation of this marketplace that it will require money. So what kind of measures will be needed in order to comply with that? Well, according to MV5, which released a study just this week and was released to the public last night, according to MV5, an environmental consulting firm hired by the Department of Public Service, in the first 5 years, most of this will be done with biofuels. In the first 5 years, that's the yellow mark. So just to clarify what these terms mean, energy efficiency is the light green line, and that means weatherization, air sealing, making your home tighter, right? Fuel switching is kind of a misnomer. It includes using another piece of equipment that doesn't use fossil fuel, like a heat pump or a modern wood stove, but it doesn't necessarily mean you are not using the fossil fuel heating system. In fact, what we find for most of the heating contractors can affirm this is that when you install a heat pump or a wood stove, it is supplemental heat. It might become the majority of your heat source, but it's usually in combination with your existing furnace or boiler, whether it's gas or oil fired. So even though it says fuel switching, in fact, the reality is that for the vast majority of homes in which this type of clean heat measure equipment, wood stoves and heat pumps are installed, it's providing supplemental heat, driving down the gallons used, but not replacing them entirely. And then there's clean fuels, and clean fuels are generally sustainably sourced biofuels as shown in the law. This includes renewable propane, renewable natural gas, includes biodiesel and renewable diesel that's being sold. And because these fuels is more akin to switching in that you can use these fuels in existing equipment, that's why the consultant firm determined that, in fact, over the first 5 years, to make that first metric, make that first mandate to reduce emissions by 40% by the end of the decade, that it will be biofuels that gets us there, not equipment and not weatherization. That's according to the study. And the reason why, well, part of it is just the ease, which is it's easier to switch fuel rather than change out a piece of equipment, but also the economics of it. So the MV5 study, again, released last night, shows that there's economic energy efficiency and uneconomic energy efficiency, meaning with the amount of money that you would spend in order to improve the shell of your home would not give back a significant return on investment. And you see that with equipment and with certain clean fuels. But over at least the first 5 years, the environmentalists concur that it will be a environmental consulting firm confirms that it will be biofuels that gets us there. It will largely be residential as well. You know, biofuels can go into any tank that burns fossil fuels now. But the real gains, particularly in the outer years, are going to be residential. That's where consumers have more choice about what fuels they sell in industrial processes, in some commercial processes. You know, that you see that in the blue and green lines there. It's a lot hard, even though they represent 35% of the gallons sold, the commercial industrial, it's more difficult to electrify these sectors, and the emissions reduction potentials are much stronger in residential homes than they are in commercial. So as a result, commercial industrial, who has to continue to use fossil fuels because they are there's no viable alternative, they'll bear more of the cost than residential. So how will it be paid? Again, needs money in order to create these incentives to transform the marketplace. There's really 3 ways to do it. There's the existing FGR 615 form. That's the tax that fuel dealers pay to the tax department to fund the weatherization program. 2 cents a gallon on every gallon, paid on the 25th of the month for the prior month, that goes into the tax department, which then pays for low-income weatherization. The problem is that the universe of taxpayers here is the retailers, whereas the universe of taxpayers, as envisioned by the Clean Heat Standard, is the wholesalers and about 80% of the retailers, but not all of the retailers. So that would have to change in statute if they decided to go for that level of payment. The other way is how we pay our diesel and gasoline tax, and that is to the Department of Motor Vehicles on Form CV 102. And what that does is it pays on the 25th of the month for a gallon sold the prior month. It's a much smaller list because it's the distributors, more like the clean heat model. But the universe of gasoline and diesel sellers compared to the universe of heating oil and propane sellers, well, there's a little bit of overlap, not much. So it's an entirely new world. Or the Public Utility Commission could invent a new way to collect the fee from those sellers of heating oil, propane, in that it could be then distributed to the incentive program. But we don't know that yet. That's a known unknown, how that's going to work. But the big question, let's get right to the bottom line here. The big question, and then this is when we'll wrap up, is what will it all cost? And this is controversial, right? Because this is going to be decided by the legislature in January. And what we've said all along is that we don't know. We don't know the answer. We've had estimates. The first estimate came back in February of 2023, was done by Secretary of the Agency of Natural Resources, who estimated it'll cost about $2 billion over the next 5 years in order to move the market in a way that we will comply with the Global Warming Solutions Act. And that's even with $800 million in state and federal money already devoted to the mission of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the thermal sector. And that number, simple math, comes out to about 70 cents a gallon. Some argued that was way too high. Some argued that was way too low. But there it sat for a year and a half as we waited for the potential study to be released by the environmental consulting firm NV5, which it was last night. And here it is. So in the back page, on page 62, 63 of this, it shows that something we all know, a significant financial commitment is necessary by the state of Vermont, or required, in order to meet Vermont's emission reduction goals. They shouldn't have said goals, they should have said mandates, because it is a mandate. The law requires us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 by 40%. If not, the state could be sued. In Act 18, the Clean Heat Standard requires it to be designed in a way to meet that mandate. So these are serious numbers because the law requires them to be addressed as such. So the scenario is a couple different scenarios for natural gas, for propane, for fuel oil, which includes kerosene, as modeled, which means the most amount of economic activity could happen. That's the high end, and 60% modeled with other less funding. And there's two other steps, but the lowest cost is 60% modeled for less funding, meaning we're getting money from the federal and state government for other programs, and we're understanding that we're not going to pay for the entire project, that over the course of everyone, that there'll have to be some buy-in from consumers who have to spend their own money, but 60% is the number that will be required in order to move the marketplace. But these are MMBTUs, which most people can't convert, so we've done the work for you. For propane, 23.2 MMBTU per gallon. It is $2.12 per gallon at the high end, 94 cents at the low end for fuel oil and kerosene. 29.1 MMBTU is $4.03 a gallon at the high end, and at 12.9 MMBTU is $1.79 at the low end. Simple math gets us to the average retail price of heating fuels as of August of this year, which is reported every month by the Department of Public Service. Kerosene's $4.17. Number two fuel oil, heating oil, is $3.51. Propane is $2.95. Again, this is the average retail price according to the Vermont Department of Public Service. The low clean heat fee, $1.78 for fuel oil and kerosene. High end $4.01 for propane, 95 cents at the low end, $2.12 at the high end. That means we're looking at a fee on kerosene that could put the price per gallon at $8.18 or $5.95 if the lower end is chosen. Heating oil could be as high as $7.52 if the high end is chosen, and propane at $5.07. let me just say this very clearly. This is not a tax. This is not a fee that is now. This is an environmental report indicating what level of investment is required and how that money would be paid for, depending on the BTU equivalent of the fossil fuel currently being used and the carbon emissions, the carbon intensity of those different fuels. That's how we got to that number. Many people could disagree with that number. They say it's too high. Some people could say it's too low. That debate will continue, but it's not real unless and until the Public Utility Commission creates a ceiling for that credit price, and then the legislature agrees to adopt that. The price could be adjusted later on as the default delivery agent, which administers the incentives, creates a different budget based on what's happening in the market. But we fully expect this rule, this regulation, to be finalized, to be the first draft of the rule to come out in October based on this study. It will be finalized in December. It will be presented to the legislature in January with a cost per gallon similar to what you've seen, different, most assuredly different, but something. And the legislature will be able to decide, yes, this fee in this program will in fact reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order for us to be in compliance with the Global Warming Solutions Act. If the fee is too low, it might not be enough to move the market, and someone who wanted a higher fee could sue the state saying that you haven't done enough. You've taken half measures. You haven't done enough to meet the greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements. A lot of unknowns happening, but I've been working on this for 4 years now. We are in the top of the 8th. There's 2 more innings to go, and there is still so much that still needs to be determined. And of course, the biggest question of all, will the legislature approve it? And will it become law? We don't know those answers yet, but this is the best information we have so far. I want to remind everyone that this is not a ban on the fuel that you use to heat your home. It is absolutely not. Nor is it a carbon tax yet. We don't know what the fee will be. All of this will be decided in the next 90 days, presented in front of the legislature, who will take about 3 months to figure out, or 4 months. But by the end of May, we'll know what the fee will be and whether or not all those credits have value and who owns them. And then the first obligation will start on January 1 of 2026. So that's a lot. I appreciate you paying attention, and I will post this at meadowhillmedia.com/CHS if you'd like to share. There's also a very easy form where you can post comments, ask questions, and I will try to aggregate as many questions as I can from all the different people who want to know how this program is going to work. And I will post frequently asked questions here as well, and then I'll distribute it through all the different channels. So you are all invited to ask questions in the chat, or if not, have a great day. Appreciate you spending time with me today.
Matt, chat's disabled.
Yeah, I hear someone asking a question. I'm here. Feel free to drop off if you've got to go somewhere. I will record it, but thank you for those that are staying, and feel free to ask any questions you want. And I will unlock the chat if people would rather write them.
Matt?
Yeah.
So Chris Pritchard, I was at your meeting at Procter Gas last week. And I have a couple.
Hold on, Chris, for 1 second. I'm sorry for that. Yeah. I have unlocked the chat. If you would prefer to enter your question in the chat, not you, Chris, but anyone else would like to put their question in the chat, they're free to do that. You're also free, of course, to log off, but I appreciate it. I'll be here for the next half an hour for anyone who wants to chat in the chat or chat live. Chris, go ahead. Thank you for that interruption.
Okay, so just a quick quick, Matt, a few questions. One of the things you said last week is currently 9% of the registrations are EVs, and that number has to be 35% by.
Yeah,
Right.
Chris, that's a different policy.
Okay.
That's transportation policy and completely different sector.
Nothing to do with Act 18.
Yeah, exactly. That's a completely separate policy. Similar to the Clean Heat Standard, it is in response to the Global Warming Solutions Act that requires a reduction in emissions. But as we know, emissions come from various places. The two largest are heating and transportation. That's the policy regarding EVs to reduce transportation emissions from transportation fuels. This is the big ticket policy, although there's others, but the biggest one that will reduce emissions from heating. So
Okay.
two different things, all serving the same law or trying to respond to the same law, which is the 2020 Global Warming Solutions Act.
So then the $20,000 penalty, that would fall under that also.
Oh yeah, that would be on manufacturers.
Okay. So now I thought, unless I misunderstood you said something about, you talked about the natural gas pipeline that goes to Middlebury. Did I understand you correctly that fuel was going to be exempt?
No, natural gas is a fossil fuel, and it will absolutely pay a clean heat fee.
Okay.
There's one supplier of natural gas, that's Vermont Gas Systems, and they will either have to pay the fee for the fossil gallons they sell or have to obtain credits by selling renewable natural gas or doing other things that earn credits. It's not clear who owns these credits. That still has to be sorted out in a very short amount of time. However, every company that sells fossil fuels, including Vermont Gas Systems, will have to figure out whether they want to pay the fee, earn the credits, buy or barter for the credits, or some mixture of both.
Okay. Good. Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? You can put it in the chat. You feel free to enter them on the website or shout them out. And
Matt, it's Kevin from 7 Days. Do you have a second?
hey, Kevin.
How are you? I have a quick question about biofuels. Given that you project that biofuels would be embraced or need to be embraced in the short term, can you discuss a little bit what analysis is being done about whether biofuels and which biofuels would in fact result in a reduction of emissions? Some people feel as though biofuels actually produce similar or more emissions when the life cycle of those biofuels is calculated. Can you tell me who's doing that analysis and when that happens?
Yeah. So if I could reframe your question just slightly, even though I know I know Kevin is a fantastic reporter, and please read all of his stuff in 7 days. But when this isn't my prediction, this is NV5, the environmental consulting firm, that their analysis, which they delivered last night to the state, as per their contract, said that in the first 5 years, especially, that it won't be installed measures or services such as weatherization, heat pumps, or wood stove. That will be the biofuel, the clean fuels themselves. That in the first 5 years, that will be key to meeting really the second deadline, which is the 40% reduction by 2030. So okay, so that's their analysis. I tend to agree with it, but that's their analysis. How that gets sorted out is being done within consultation with the technical advisory groups. The technical advisory group is encouraging the Public Utility Commission to adopt a recognized national standard for measuring the carbon intensity of biofuels, doing an entire life cycle analysis. In fact, that's baked into the law. The law requires them to do such, to measure the carbon emitted, not just when the fuel is combusted, but during when it is created and when it's transported into Vermont. So that analysis, which is done for motor fuels when it comes to low carbon fuel standards, such as the one in California, it's done using the GREET analysis, which is developed by the U.S. Department of Energy, by the Argonne National Laboratories. And that is the most comprehensive way to determine whether or not a gallon of renewable diesel, a therm of renewable natural gas, a gallon of renewable propane or biodiesel, and depending on the supply, the stock of where it comes from, whether it comes from used cooking oil or soybeans or methane, to determine if it is in fact a lower carbon intensity than the fuel it's replacing, which is a fossil fuel. So that analysis is still being done, which leads to the next natural question, which is, so if you just swap out a fossil fuel for a biofuel that is listed as receiving credit, what will the cost differential be? And we don't know the answer yet, because every biofuel will receive a different credit amount. But you can already think ahead to, well, what's the compliance fee if I just pay the fee and sell fossil fuel? Well, that will be a number. And then there'll be a number that says, well, what if I don't sell that gallon of fossil fuel and I sell a gallon of biofuel instead? And if that number is less than the compliance fee, you can see what's going to happen in the marketplace. More biofuel will come into Vermont. And that may be part of the analysis that MV5 did. But the opposite is also true. If a gallon of sustainably sourced biofuel is more, because this is a market-based, this is a capitalistic market-based program. If a gallon of biofuel that receives credit is still higher than a gallon of fossil fuel with the fee, then not always, but there will be certain sectors of our economy that choose that gallon of fossil fuel with the fee rather than the biofuel, if that is in fact cheaper. So all this market-based system has a lot to be understood, because we don't know what the fee will be, we don't know what the credit value will be, and we don't know what the market will deliver to those that distribute heating fuels and biofuels in 2026, when this fee becomes real, if it becomes law in 2025. I hope that wasn't too long-winded of an answer, Kevin.
It does. No, so the key moment will be when the technical advisory committee assesses which biofuels, the life cycle of those fuels, when they analyze the life cycle of those fuels and the relative carbon intensity of those fuels. That'll be a key moment, right?
It'll be a key moment. Now, advisory group, it's right in the title. We don't decide. There are a number of consultants working with the advisory group members, and of course the public. These are all public meetings, all posted on YouTube every other week. But it'll be the PUC that decides based on this entire analysis, the advice from the technical advisory group, the advice from the equity advisory group, the analysis from the various consultants that are contributing, public comments, and then ultimately the PUC will decide if this biofuel is sustainably sourced, and what value in terms of a credit value will be attributed to it.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
Yep. Any
Matt?
other? Yeah, go ahead.
My name's Linwood Mixer. I live on the eastern side of Vermont. You've made comments about the southern end of Vermont and how competitive the fuel prices could become. Where we're located along the Connecticut River, all our fuel, well, I'm going to say most people up here in Vermont, is coming from over in New Hampshire side.
Yep.
I personally have spoken to about 3 suppliers across the river in Connecticut, in Vermont, in New Hampshire, I should say. And they are taking a wait and see attitude as to whether they want to get involved in sell fuel over here anymore, which eliminates the, as you said, competitive atmosphere, because they're going to walk away. And I don't see them, even if they stick it on, they're going to get into competition. The price is the price. And the fee you're talking about is going to get passed through to the consumer, no doubt about it. And if these suppliers from New Hampshire do decide to stay away, that means our closest suppliers are over an hour's drive, which is not only going to tack on a fee, but it's also going to tack on transportation costs and the availability of vehicles to try and get fuel to us. I think of many of us living in the rural areas here on the eastern side, where we're dependent on fossil fuels. We have standby generators because our electricity can be irregular. And then we got to make sure we got a propane supplier, if that's the case. There's a lot more to this that our friends in Montpelier and Burlington aren't thinking about, with the true Vermonters that are living here in the rural areas that have to survive, and how it's going to drive the price up on everything on the fuel side. And as we all know, and economically on the eastern side of the Vermont, in certain areas, we are really, really depressed. So I just think there's more to this. I saw a lady's comment about how, if this could be amended, And I don't ever see that happen with the legislators and the supermajority in Montpelier controlling things right now. This is going to fly right through no matter what happens. But that's just my observation after watching the legislature over the last 40, 50 years. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Linwood, and thank you for participating. I would just say, depending on where you live, it will have different results, clearly. And that's the same with the regulated community. So there are a handful of fuel suppliers mostly around Chittenden County that rely on the 2 terminals located in Chittenden County. And while they have to register and file and do all the paperwork and do all that, and ultimately it'll be their wholesale supplier that pays the fee. There's no question about that. But that is unusual because we're so rural. Most fuel suppliers have their own bulk storage. And because they want the best possible price for their customers, they shop around and they find where that gallon is, whether it's sold in Quebec, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, or New York. And we certainly want to preserve the ability for fuel retailers to price shop because they know their customers are price shopping as well. And it's still a competitive industry. The regulation is modeled after what they do for utilities, but we are fundamentally different from utilities. Utilities have a guaranteed monopoly and rate of return. You don't have competing choices for electricity, but the price is regulated. And investments that electric utility makes in their infrastructure and their delivery model and their cost for procuring those electrons, those are passed on to the customer in a regulated price. Prices do go up and they do go down for unregulated fuels, but it's the competitive market, as you identified, that helps put downward pressure on that. And yeah, if there's fewer of them and higher prices, it becomes difficult to figure out how this is sustainable in our rural regions of Vermont. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, this is Mike Jasinski. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you, Mike.
Hey, there's going to be a huge ramification to all businesses in Vermont. You know, you can start from McDonald's or where you go to work to heat the building, all the way up through the chain, and it's all going to come back to what coming out of your paycheck. You're going to have a hard time living in Vermont.
Yeah. Again,
has any thought been given to this when they think about these things? I mean, it's nice to live in a wonderful world where the air is so purified, but the normal person can't survive financially. What about the people who live on Social Security and get food stamps and heating fuel? Are they going to pay the 70 cents, $3 a gallon? No, the state won't tax them on it. It's not fair.
Well, so everyone pays regardless of who they are, what it's being used for, if it's heating oil, propane, or kerosene or natural gas, if you're using it for a thermal industrial process, or you're using it to cook your hot dogs, or you're using it to stay warm, it's all in the residential, commercial, industrial sector. And I would say, and then I'm going to let Representative Sims talk, which is the people that pass this care passionately about reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They're concerned about climate change, and they want to make sure that that Vermont does its part or its share to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's why the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed. But now we're faced with what are the implications of the policies that will achieve those ends. And what we're learning is that it will cost money, not a surprise. Most things.
Yeah, but the thing is that it is going to cost money, but the ramifications are so great to the average person in Vermont, they can't survive and live here.
Yeah, it will be challenging for many. Okay, I'm going to let Catherine Sims.
Thank you.
Catherine?
Yeah, thanks, Matt, and everyone for the comments and questions. I just want to thank you, Matt. I appreciate the information that you provided and the number of times that I think you've emphasized what was passed was a study, and that we have set in motion this effort to learn more about what it would look like and what it would cost, with real analysis, and nothing is set in stone. To the question in the chat, we can amend, we can not move forward. And that's the really robust conversation that will happen next session. And, appreciate the previous speakers, reflections on, yes, emissions reductions are important, but so is affordability and viability for our communities, especially our rural communities. And so, I think that conversation is better informed now that we have these reports coming back with hard estimates on costs, and nothing is set in stone. And appreciate, Matt, the number of times you sort of emphasized that this is just one step in the process. And it's up to the legislature whether we move forward with it or we amend it or we don't. And so, really appreciate your effort to spread the word about this process, and
Thank you,
look
Representative.
forward to the conversation in the coming session.
That's exactly right, Representative Sims. These are numbers, these are estimates put together by consulting firms that will be reviewed by the Public Utility Commission. That will be in a rule because that's what they're required to do under law. But it's ultimately up to whoever's elected on November 5th and whoever takes office on January to determine whether or not this becomes law. And if it doesn't, what replaces it? Or if nothing replaces it, what is the reaction to a potential lawsuit for Vermont's failure to act on climate? So these are the difficult challenges for anyone that's going to work in Montpelier in 2025.
Matt, I do
Marty
have one
Feltus, you have a
question here.
question? You raised your hand, Marty?
Yes, I did raise my hand. Thank you, Matt.
Yep.
You mentioned that NVF figured that during the first 5 years, these clean fuel uses would be from sustainably sourced biofuels. And can you tell us again what those are and where they are available?
Yeah, so it's a bit confusing how it's described. So when it says fuel switching, what it means is equipment that doesn't use fossil fuels. So that would be like modern wood heating and cold climate heat pumps. But for clean fuels, that's defined as that energy source that has less carbon intensity than what it's replacing. So for heating oil, a substitute for heating oil is renewable diesel or biodiesel. Now, renewable diesel and biodiesel comes from a variety of sources. It can be called UCO, or used cooking oil, that comes from French fry or restaurant grease, recycled oil. It can come from virgin oil crops, such as soybeans that are grown in Nebraska or South Dakota. It could come from the rendering process for animals, the fats and tallows that can create biodiesel through a process. Biodiesel and renewable diesel uses the same exact feedstocks. It's just a different process for which to produce that fuel. Renewable propane is another substitute fuel that comes from the production of renewable diesel. It's a gas that comes from when you take the oils from soybeans and cover crops and other crops, then you can produce renewable propane. Renewable natural gas comes from methane. And natural gas is methane, but renewable natural gas comes from methane that is from farms and from waste facilities that can be piped into the pipe. It doesn't include wood. Wood is not a part of the sustainably sourced biofuel, but the equipment that burns wood would qualify under the program as designed. How much credit each fuel gets, that comes from something other than crude oil. And will it be enough credit in order to move the market? We don't know those answers yet. But I think there's a wide recognition that electrification alone cannot and will not, and perhaps is too costly to achieve the Global Warming Solutions Act mandated emission reductions, that biofuels will play a significant role. And what the report also shows is that weatherization, air sealing, will play less of a role. Now, many people could disagree with these numbers. This is just one environmental consultant and their analysis. And it likely isn't going to be the final analysis, but it's the best data points we have so far. And it's the newest data points we have so far. Patrick, you have a question?
Yeah, I did, Matt. Hey, so a little bit of my background, I did come from the HVAC field. I am now taking over a manufacturing company that my father started. We have 3 large manufacturing businesses in central Vermont. And you kind of, this follows up to what you're just speaking to about the biofuels playing a role. I looked into, we upfitted one of our new facilities that has 54-foot ceilings in it. And it's over 27,000 square feet. Like I said, a large manufacturing plant. Now, my question is, when I was looking for a heat source, I looked into wood chip boilers and others, and a lot of the companies that I was talking to said that Vermont isn't that friendly for them, and they're there isn't a lot of incentive to put them in. Also, with a space that large, like I said, with my background, there is not a heat pump source that is going to take care of that building. I do have large air circulation in there with BAF fans. I am doing a 100%, if you will, efficient. It is a direct fired unit that is off of propane. But I guess what would you say would be, as a business owner that is looking down the road at this large cost increase, what would be the route to go for, large manufacturers that are going to be looking at this?
That's a great question, and it sort of reminds me of the point made by the NV5 consulting report, the slide that I showed that it'll be easier to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the residential sector than it will be in the commercial industrial, because of the points that you just made. While your story is unique to your building and your experience there are many different similar but different stories in which there may not be a simple fix, off-the-shelf fix. If this becomes law, there does allow for what's called custom measures. So if you want to invest in your business and realize that your building is unique and isn't going to just install a bunch of pellet stoves or heat pumps to solve your issue, but that you came up with a answer, you found an HVAC partner or a fuel dealer that could help devise a custom carbon reduction strategy for your business, that could qualify for credits, maybe, still to be determined. But I think there is a recognition that, especially for commercial industrial, as evidenced in the report, it's going to be very difficult. For instance, if you use 20,000 gallons of propane a year to heat up asphalt to spread on the highway, there's really not an alternative there that is readily available, easily implementable. If you use steam in the manufacturing process, there may not be a readily available electric version, just like in the same thing with the transportation world, where yes, you can get around in an electric car, but for some heavy duty trucks or off-road equipment, that becomes more challenging, and when that products aren't available. So yeah, it's going to be difficult for commercial industrial to.
So one thing, thank you
Yeah,
for answering that. We have a union, and the employees here are under that union, and this is for space heating, and we don't utilize it for our process per se. We have mandates on what temperature we have to keep our large manufacturing facilities at under the union. So I cannot just have them throw a sweatshirt on, and so we have to maintain that temperature. Now, we, as a company, I want to think green, and I'm looking at the possibilities, but also, trying to keep all of our employees, I guess, gainfully employed and be competitive and with other states around the nation that are manufacturing a similar product. This is going to be tough. And I know other people have come on and voiced their concerns about the average Vermonter. We have a lot that work for us that you would say that the common Vermonters, we love them. And I am a little bit nervous on this, and I just want to see a little more attention, I guess, brought to that business sector and in the manufacturing sector on how we can solve this problem. And I know you said there might be a creative way. I just feel like there's a little bit a cart in front of the horse here. And I would like to see legislature talk on that if they could. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick, for your comments. Any other comments? Please feel to enter in the chat. Go to meadowhillmedia.com/CHS or voice them now if there are no other comments. I'd like to thank everyone for joining me for this past hour, and feel free to reach out. Appreciate your time. Thank you.